Hi, I'm Jess, and today we're debating whether childhood obesity should be considered unlawful neglect. And I am pro, and it's because there's standards and laws that society puts in place because, like, children are completely dependent on their parents, and they have to, children, all children, like, should be raised so that they can live successful lives and like the best possible lives that they can be. And parents have a lot of choices, but at the end of the day, their children need to be able to live successful lives. And feeding them bad food is a conscious choice that parents make that causes harm. To get to the point where you're obese, like that's a lot of food that you have to consume, and that's like already like super unhealthy food. Not only like diabetes, heart failure, organ failure, but there's so many different health problems that can come into place that would ruin that child's life in so many different ways and limit their choices. And then also on top of it, like it's not socially acceptable to be obese, and like they could have like a lot of ridicule from their classmates, and that could just cause a lot of social issues and self-esteem issues. So overall, parents who do this are neglecting their children and not making the right decisions.
Hi, I'm Joe, and I think clearly the con side is the way to go here, and for two main reasons. And the first thing that I want to talk about is how considering childhood obesity to be unlawful neglect would disproportionately punish poor families, mainly because poor families are the families that are most likely to have members that have obesity problems, because it's really hard under financial constraints to be able to feed your child in an effective way, to be able to give people the right nutrition, actually have a healthy diet. And that's not something that these sorts of families can actually control. So first of all, they don't deserve to be punished for this sort of, it's not like they're necessarily choosing for their children to be unhealthy. In some cases, it's just really hard for them to be able to do anything about it and to prevent this from happening. So at the point where these people don't intend to cause this harm, it makes no sense to punish them for those sorts of things. And furthermore, we can see that punishing poor families disproportionately is bad because it just makes it harder and harder for the people who already have it the hardest in the country to begin with. And the second reason that I want to talk about is how we really put a primacy on parental rights and sort of the privacy of parents to be able to make choices for how they're going to raise their children. And a great example of this is how we don't require children to get vaccinations for a lot of things, which obviously doesn't make sense from like a medical perspective. So when Jess talks about these health problems that arise, from childhood obesity, etc., the same sorts of health problems could arise from not getting vaccinations, but parents are still allowed to make that decision because we think that parents should be given a degree of freedom of choice over how they raise their children.
Okay, Joe made a lot of interesting points, but I still think that we should vote Gov. And part of it is that he talks about all of the poor families, they don't necessarily have the choice, but Gov doesn't want to punish the poor. And it's basically just about keeping your children healthy. And yes, there are some monetary restrictions, but that's a lot of food that you need to consume to be obese. There are some choices that can be made, that aren't. And then second, he talks about parental rights. And a lot of what I said before, is that yes, parents have the right to choose, but there are standards and laws to keep the children healthy and to keep them so that they can have the best possible lives. And the way that parents raise their kids, yes, they have choices in cultural senses and in different ways. But when it comes to the point where the child is at risk and the child cannot live full lives, then the state needs to come in and do something. And in this case, as I said before, there's so many health issues that are associated with obesity. There's so many social issues that it just doesn't make sense. You can't compare it to vaccination, because obesity, vaccination is debated in some ways, but obesity, it is guaranteed to kill you, and it is guaranteed that people are going to make fun of you, and it's just not.
So Jess talks a lot about the idea that the state needs to do something to make sure that these bad, harmful consequences don't happen to children. But the problem is that in this case, we're not just talking about whether the state will intervene or not, but we're talking about considering something to be unlawful. Unlawful neglect implies that there's going to be some sort of punishment to follow afterwards. And that's one of the most important problems when we talk about this issue, because it's very clear that creating a situation where it's really, really likely that poor families are going to face these sorts of problems when it comes to prosecution for these issues means that there's going to be that punishment. And Jess hasn't really explained to you how these people necessarily deserve to be punished. She sort of just says, oh, well, you have to eat a ton of food for this to happen. But clearly it's a lot easier to eat well if you don't have such severe financial restraints, right? And punishing people disproportionately just because they're poor and maybe can't afford to have such a good diet simply doesn't make any sense, because punishment should be based on desert. It shouldn't be based on financial status or something arbitrary like that. And then Jess then continues to mainly stress all of these sort of the social problems that arise and the health problems arise, etc. But once again, parental choice is allowed to sometimes create situations where there are social problems and there are health problems. And yes, there is some sort of limit to that, but just hasn't really explained in an effective way, like to what extent we would be willing to, why we would draw the line at this point rather than somewhere else, why this would fall under the category of things that we'd restrain, while something like vaccinations wouldn't, which is comparable in a lot of ways. So I think clearly